Tonight's panel has a fascinating title, as you could see as you came in. Seafood from Slaves, from Investigation to Pulitzer Prize. And that's one of the most amazing things about being here this evening, and it's an incredible honor for me. I've actually never been in a place with this many Pulitzer Prize winners at once. So thank you for honoring us tonight. The significance of the title will become clear as you listen to our panelists. Before we meet them, however, I would like to acknowledge our co-sponsors, the WVU Reed College of Media and the Ogden Newspapers Seminar Series. Thanks to both of these entities and to our own Dean Mary Ann Reed of the College of Media and her team for making the event possible. Thank you, Mary Ann. I'm also delighted that the Hardistys were able to join us tonight. Would you stand, David and Susan, so we could acknowledge you? And the importance of having the Hardistys here this evening is that it was David C. Hardisty who started the Festival of Ideas when he was a student at West Virginia University. So think about all of that, you students. You can have a legacy as well. You can start something like the Festival of Ideas. David created the festival in 1995? 66. So my notes are wrong. 1966. Oh, that clarifies everything. So he started it in 66 while he was a student, but he reimagined it in 1995 while he was president and made it very much a fabric of West Virginia University's life. What an incredible living legacy that you've created. He was inspired by events he had organized and knew were very important for all of us to come together and talk about. And today, the lecture series spans the academic year and brings a group of very diverse speakers to our campus. In addition, it brings thought leaders that help us think about things in a new way. We have a wonderful opportunity this evening as part of our Diversity Week to hear from our Pulitzer Prize winning panelists who are going to talk to us about slavery in the seafood industry. And I've had a little bit of time to talk to them during dinner about what they discovered in the Asian fishing industry. Their investigation and subsequent series of reports led to the arrests of more than a dozen people, changed legislation in the United States, and freed more than 2,000 enslaved fishermen. That's just, we should pause and let that soak in. Freeing 2,000 enslaved fishermen. This spring, as we said, it earned the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service, which I learned this evening is actually the top Pulitzer, for the one for public service. And so this really is an extraordinary evening that we get to celebrate that achievement and to learn from our panelists. We're especially excited to welcome Margie Mason, whose parents and significant other is here. Just to think about what you can do as a student, Margie graduated here in 1997. We were trying to guess, we were trying to say 2010, but we knew that wasn't right, and we couldn't create a lie, just to make you younger. I'm sorry, Margie. But she graduated from the P.I. Reed School of Journalism, which is now the Reed College of Media. So you can see how much can happen to media in that short period of time. And she is a phenomenal investigative journalist, as is our other members of the panel. And our other members of the panel are going to be introduced by Emily Corio, who is truly exceptional in her own right as a teaching assistant professor in the Reed College of Media. So thank you all for being here this evening. This is going to be truly an extraordinary evening.
Thank you, Provost McConnell. Welcome to our audience here on the campus of West Virginia University and to those listening on West Virginia Public Radio. I'm Emily Coria. With me on stage are the 4 Associated Press journalists who investigated and exposed a system of modern-day slavery in the Southeast Asian fishing industry. Much of Margie Mason's work at the Associated Press has focused on poverty and human rights abuses. Margie received her journalism degree from WVU in 1997. She started working at her hometown newspaper, the Dominion Post, when she was 19. Welcome home, Margie. Robin McDowell covered Southeast Asia for the AP for 2 decades. She started the AP's first regional editing desk in Thailand and oversaw the bureau in Indonesia. She's now based in the U.S. Welcome, Robin.
Thank you very much.
Martha Mendoza has reported for the AP for nearly 20 years. She's earned numerous awards along the way, and Martha was based in Santa Cruz during the investigation, but she is now currently based in Bangkok. Welcome, Martha, for making the long trip.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
Esther Htusan has been with the Associated Press for 2 years now, and during that time, she has passionately pursued stories about human rights abuses in Southeast Asia. Welcome, Esther.
Thanks for having me here.
To our audience here at WVU, you will have the opportunity to ask questions to the journalists later during this event. But now let's watch this video from the AP's Seafood from Slaves series.
This is the homecoming freed slave Mien Na has been waiting for all his adult life. Tricked into becoming a slave on a fishing boat as a teenager, he hasn't seen his family in Myanmar for 22 years. Until now. That's his sister, who was just 10 when they last saw each other. Moments later, he sees his mother. The emotions are overwhelming. For his mother, it is too much. She collapses and has to be revived.
I'm so very, very happy that I'm able to see my mother and my own siblings again. Unendingly happy.
I had a broken heart. My son, do you have a shirt and a blanket? Do you have a warm place to stay? Are other people torturing you? I had those thoughts entering my head.
In fact, people had been torturing Mien for years. His story is similar to that of hundreds of other slaves, revealed in a year-long investigation by the Associated Press into how the multi-billion-dollar fishing industry operates in Southeast Asia. An industry that relies on slaves, working in dangerous conditions like these, to supply fish to major supermarkets and stores worldwide, including the United States.
Now we'll hear from the journalist who reported this story and hear the story behind this series. We'll start with Margie Mason, who will talk about how this investigation began.
Good evening, and before I start, I just want to say thank you so much for the university for bringing us all here. We've come from, as you heard, all over the world, and I'm really thrilled that the university is hosting this event, and I wanted to give a special shout out to Mary Ann Reed from the, and I'm going to say it correctly, I'm not going to say the School of Journalism, the Reed College of Media. Thank you so much for bringing us and for seeing the value in doing this. A lot of people ask us how we started this story, and you know, I would like to say that we came up with the idea all ourselves, but really this was a story that was an open secret in Asia for many years. We had seen stories about men who had escaped and read stories about things that had happened on these boats, and it was in November or December of 2013. So 2013, and we were, Robin and I, were working on another story about the Rohingya ethnic Muslim minority in Myanmar who are being persecuted and forced to flee their country. And in doing so, I was meeting with a source of mine at the International Organization for Migration. And he said, well, that's a great story, but you know, there's another story that you guys could look at. And he showed me some data, and the numbers that he showed me, they were climbing for the number of fishermen that they were finding, mostly from Myanmar and Cambodia and Laos, and some from Thailand as well. And he said, you know, if you want to look at this, I'll help you. So I came back to the office in Jakarta and phoned up Robin, and we talked about it, and we said, this is going to be a tough story, but maybe a way to make people care about this would be to look at where this fish is going. We knew it was going to the United States, but we needed to be able to connect the fish to the consumer and actually name names with the stores that were supplying this fish. And we also thought that it would be compelling and would make people care if we found men who were being held captive. So with that, we worked for, I would say, about 9 months, still doing our daily work, but working kind of behind the scenes on this and hitting one wall after another and getting very frustrated along the way. But eventually, we got a source who told us about an island in the far eastern part of Indonesia. And she said, we've heard a lot of men are there. We haven't been there. No one's been there. We're not really sure, but we think there might be something there. So then Robin was tasked with going there, and I will hand it over to her now.
Yeah, so like Margie said, we really didn't know what to expect when we got there. And it was a long journey. I was in Myanmar at that time. It was about 30 hours by various planes and boats, and yeah, that's right. Until we finally pulled up to the island in a small wooden kind of ferry ship. And one of the most disconcerting things immediately was realizing that the fishing business that we were able to see by Google Earth was on the opposite side of a village. You can see that right here is the fishing business, but that was private property, and the village where we were allowed to actually, meet with people and talk to people under the kind of guise, in my case, as a tourist, and the photographer and the videographer that I went with were talking about doing a story about fishing and how great the fishing industry was. So we were sitting tantalizingly close to this huge fishing compound, and we could go on boats and see men on the boats painting the sides of the ship. But we couldn't really tell, are these men being forced to work? Are they Burmese? Are they slaves? Which is what we were looking for. So it took a while to find out what was going on. It took, some of the men had escaped and were living now in nearby villages, and told us that they had been working on these boats years ago, and the brutal conditions, like really horrifying conditions they'd been forced to work under, beaten, working 22 hours a day, sometimes 24 hours a day, being yelled at, treated like dogs, they would say, being away from their families, having no way to get home. But what we were looking for, as Margie said, were people who were currently forced to work on boats, and we didn't really feel that talking to people who'd been on the boats a couple of years ago was going to be enough. So I called Esther. She was in Burma. She's our fiery Burmese reporter who had done really daring reporting on the Rohingya as well and other rights abuses in Myanmar, and thought if anyone's going to crack the lid open on this and get to talk to these men and hear the stories firsthand, it's going to be her. So she showed up after reaching her. This area is so remote that you can only reach it a few months a year because there's high seas. There's no cell phone tower, so you can get messages out by sending text messages. You had to climb a hill behind the village, and there were like maybe a half a bar or one bar, and I think it took about 4 hours before I was able to get to her and tell her she needed to get over there. And I'll hand it over to Esther now so she can tell us what she experienced on arriving. So as I arrived
to the island where Robin was there already, and as I arrived, it took me several hours to get there, and I just thought that it was the end of the war, and why would I be here? But as I met Robin, and then she explained to me some more information about what's going on there. But by that time, we didn't really see a lot of fishermen who were currently walking. But then as I arrived to this village where Robin and I were supposed to stay together, this young man showed up at the small food store where we were having dinner, and we started talking, and I was just so shocked that we were speaking the same language. And that's when I started to ask questions about how they get to this island, to this far remote area. Robin and I started interviewing as many men as possible when we were there under limited time. And this is how they explain how they got to this island. They were tricked from Burma. They were tricked to Thailand, promised job promised a better job in Thailand, but they were trafficked to the fishing boats right away as they got to Thailand, and they have these fake documents that he is holding right now, and this is the Thai identity for many Burmese men when they got onto the fishing boat. Many were tricked, many were kidnapped, many were drugs. There were many different kinds of trafficking of the way they got to the fishing boats. And the more we stayed and the more we found men on the island, we found more stories. Robin had been to some of the area before I arrived to this island, but then this fisherman who we already talked to, they started taking us to places where they walk on the fishing grounds in a company compound, and some area like this they call it the coconut farm, which is a graveyard for them. Many fishermen die under brutal working condition, and they were buried in this area under the fake Thai names. So this is the guy who actually explained it to us and showed us a place where he actually buried his own friend who died on a fishing boat. And we were taken to the company compound, which is not basically not allowed for strangers or outsiders. But some of these Burmese fishermen, they took me into the company compound, the one that we saw on satellite before. And in the middle of this company compound, I saw this cage or a jail-like house in the middle of the compound. And this Burmese guys, they took me to this prison, and I started talking why they were in prison. Some of these guys said we arrived here about 5 years ago. We didn't even know we were supposed to be here, and before I could really reach farther, I was kicked out from the company compound. That some of the security guys didn't allow us to come around anymore. So what Robin and I did was we took turn that taking out as many men as possible to interview them outside of the company compound. So some of the fishermen came after us later. About a couple of days later, they came over and looking for Robin and me to that they heard some news that some journalists were there, and then they wanted to tell their stories to us. So they risked their life talking to us as well on the island. Some of them would come up with these little pieces of papers, written down the addresses and phone numbers of their families, and they wanted us to tell their families that they are still alive. Since the day they left from home, their family never knew that they were still alive or not. So while Robin and I were there, we kept we try to get as many data as possible about this fisherman, and we try to note the names of the fishing boats and the name of the ships. That's when Robin got to Margie again on this information.
So this is Margie. When Robin saw the Silver Sea Line, we had been looking at this ship. This is a large refrigerated cargo ship, and they do a lot of pickups. It's called transshipment at sea. So a lot of times this boat will stay at sea, and the trawlers will put their fish on, and that basically keeps them in at sea. They supply them, and they can stay out there for months or even years. This one happened to be docked, and she saw the men loading the slave-caught fish onto this boat, and that then provided us with our vital link that we needed to connect the dots. And so we all started, and I don't know why this is doing this, we all started each of these refrigerated cargo ships, and this is a Thai-based ship. They have beacons on them that emit these satellite signals. And so we were able to go on to a program and basically follow the ship's journey. And so we were all kind of watching it as it went. And when it got close to Thailand, Samut Sakhon is the port that it went into. I flew in from Jakarta, and Robin flew in from Myanmar. And at that point, we decided to follow the ship, the trucks, as they were being loaded up with the seafood, because we didn't know where the seafood was going. And so at that point, we started to do surveillance. And, you know, we tell this story and everybody thinks that we were this, you know, highly tuned, finely oiled machine like you see in the movies, but we were more like the Keystone Cops, I can tell you. You know, we were, obviously we're foreigners and we stick out in this town, and we had been warned that this was a town that was controlled by a fish mafia and that it could get dangerous, and we were doing things at night, so we needed to kind of stay low profile. So we went in the back of this little Toyota pickup truck that had an extra cab on the back. And I don't know if you've ever been in one of these trucks, but there's no room. And Robin is very tall, and so we were just jammed up in this truck for, I think at times 8 hours, 10 hours at a time. And our driver was Thai. Well, none of us speak Thai. So we were trying to follow these trucks as they were going all over the city making deliveries. And there were times when we lost the truck. There were times when we overtook the truck. We were tailgating the truck. Once I think we were actually waving to the driver of the truck. And so it was comical at times, and we had to keep ourselves entertained. But we did this for 4 nights. It was a very long 4 nights. But it was necessary to connect the dots. And here you can see we're yeah, so this is one of the trucks, and this is coming out of the port where we followed. And then our colleague Martha Mendoza began putting all the pieces together for us.
Hi. So I should tell you that Margie was in touch with me and via Robin as well every morning and evening, because we were on opposite sides of the world. And while you would think that she'd be telling me the exciting names of the factories that they were seeing the trucks go into, what I was hearing as she was ending her day was that she had to eat McDonald's in the back of this really hot truck for 10 hours, and there had been nowhere to go pee, and it was, and we're gonna have to, and then she'd give me the names of 2 or 3 companies, and I'd say, that's good, but really we, you know, if they're still unloading that fish, let's continue to follow it so that we can find out where it's going. And we would definitely, all of us throughout all of this, try to encourage each other a lot, because it could be stressful. So she's sending me the names of all the companies that they're seeing these trucks go into. And what this means to us is that there's a fish from a tainted load, because that the fishermen on the island of Benjina were enslaved. Their fish that they were catching was loaded into Silver Sea. Silver Sea came into port, and it unloaded it into these trucks and went to factories. That means that the fish they caught entered a pool, and every fish in that company is now tainted with the idea of slavery. And so we used U.S. Customs bills of lading to search from where those companies in Samut-Sakhon were shipping to in the United States. So seafood exports to seafood importers in the United States. And then from those importers, we would find out what labels they're selling the seafood under, which is a little bit complicated because if you go in the market, you'll find a lot of fish has just a plastic wrap on it, and it won't say where it's a product of, and certainly not who the importer or exporter was. I spent a lot of time at the supermarket looking at fish. My kids spent an inordinate amount of time at the supermarket looking at fish. For example, these cans of Fancy Feast. Now, I was going back to Robin and Esther and saying, what species of fish did you see them loading on in Benjina? And then if that species is in a can of Fancy Feast and it tracks through that supply chain and the can says product of Thailand in increasingly small letters, then we know that it is in our pool. My husband took me on a date night to Walmart because it's quite a trip from our house. I was driving a field trip with my daughter, and I had all these little girls get out of the car and go into another store and examine all the bags of fish for me with their sharp little young eyes. Eventually, these were all the companies that we tracked it to. And so then we were able to publish the story, which was that seafood tainted by slavery that is caught by men on this island is now being shipped to the United States. The reaction was very swift all over the world. Naming all those companies forced them to respond, and consumers responded as well. But another piece of this is that there's a law in the United States that says you cannot bring in products that are the result of forced labor. And so Congress began holding hearings right away to figure out why that law was not being enforced. We identified I found two words in the law that were an exception, a loophole, and those two words were consumptive demand. And it said, you can import products of forced labor if there's a consumptive demand. And since fish from Thailand can't be got somewhere else, they were saying that there was a consumptive demand, and they began closing the loophole. And in fact, in January of this year, they did. President Obama signed it. Meanwhile, back on the island,
it's Robin. So at the same time, we got lucky many times during this investigation. And one of the biggest pieces of luck was there was a really new government in Indonesia and a fisheries minister who was amazing. We knew when we found those men in the cage, and when we went back to her with the stories about how this company, a Thai-owned company, was operating illegally on an Indonesian island, that she would be furious and that she would do something. So there's a lot of times when you're reporting human rights issues or any kind of tragedies, tsunamis, earthquakes, whatever, and you meet these families or people who are suffering and have lost people and are sick or whatever, you rarely can tell them, we really think that it's going to be okay, that you're going to be able to get out of this situation. But in this case, we knew that the fisheries minister would not tolerate this, that she would be furious, and that she would really take action. And she did immediately. She sent a team of investigators, a government team, to Benjina within 2 weeks. And initially, they were just going to go to interview the men, to make sure that our claims were accurate, to see what other kind of abuses the Thai companies were guilty of, including, basically stealing fish from her country, and millions and millions of dollars worth of fish every year. And this had been going on for decades. And as soon as the men started talking to her team of investigators and confirming the stories that we'd have been published and told her, and also that in addition to what we'd reported, that there was a man on the island who was an Indonesian villager who was kind of the enforcer. So while the Thai captains could do whatever they wanted to these guys when they were on the ships, when they got onto Indonesian soil, they were afraid to act. So they would hire this Indonesian enforcer to beat them, to threaten them, to basically, the stories that we heard, that they heard several times, were if they were threatening to run away or to not work, the enforcer would march them up a hill behind the factory grounds, handcuff them to a flagpole, and beat them until they dropped to their knees. So when the investigators heard these stories, at that point they were interviewing a group of about 15 men because the others were too afraid. They were hiding in the hills around the factory. They didn't know, this investigative team is going to leave tomorrow or tonight, and then whatever we say to these officials is going to, come back to haunt us because the captains are still on the boats. The company officials are involved, the Navy, the police, everyone was complicit. So they were really terrified to speak. The few that were brave enough to speak to those officials basically got word from the officials, okay, this is too dangerous. We can't leave you here. We're going to take you with us. I remember asking at that time one of the interviewers, like, do you mean these guys or everybody? Because I don't think they realized at that time that there were hundreds of men on that island that were basically as part of a fishing moratorium, which is kind of a long story. Most of the men were on land at that time. But they said, yeah, we're going to take all of them. It's not safe for them to come. So the word spread pretty quickly through the ranks that they were going to take these guys home. And, first it was a couple guys, then it was 10, 20, 50, 100. They just started streaming from the mountains. They started running to their boats. They were told they were going to leave that night. The fisheries ministry hadn't planned this, so they didn't have boats ready to pick them up. They were going to go on their own boats back to one of the neighboring islands and be put into government custody and protected. So because the signal was very bad, most of my communication at that time with Margie was by text message, and telling them, oh my gosh, they're going to free them, they're going to let them go, and she texts back, let all of them, yes, all of them, and then she was texting back to Martha, and I think it was just this kind of chain, like none of us could really believe this was happening, but most of all the men. And they were jumping up to their boat, their trawlers. They started to rain. They were climbing through the windows, jumping over the rails, clutching whatever belongings they could. Most of them just had a couple, pairs of pants and some shirts and some, tiny, meager belongings, and running back and making sure that they'd be counted and be allowed to leave. And really, I think this was one of my favorite stories, and part of the reason is because it was just so beautifully written by Margie. And to have this so much emotion here and such kind of euphoria and sadness and everything else, and to see Margie be able to capture that through the text messages and the few phone calls that she could get, just like really she nailed it. So this is the officials asking them when they grouped them all together, how many of you want to go home? And everybody raised their hand. And then this is them getting ready to get onto the boats. And one of our favorite parts of that story was it turned out that they didn't leave until almost midnight. And that was because a very feisty woman from the fisheries minister decided that she wanted to make sure that the enforcer was punished, and that he was went to trial and actually had to pay for his crime. And so to do that, they needed to get men to testify, and they needed to basically take like a full account, because they knew this would be their only chance. And as we were finally leaving, I got Margie again. I don't know what happened, but somebody got hold of a firework. And as the boats were going out, somebody lit off a couple of fireworks. And it was just incredibly magical, and like a beautiful end to that particular story.
And this is Margie again. So then once the men got from the island, they were taken to another island called Toole, and they were at this point in this makeshift camp that the ministry had put together. And at this point, for the first time, they were free men. They were free to speak, they were free to move around, they were laughing, they were playing traditional games, and they were cutting hair, and they were just so excited to be going home. And so I went from Jakarta here, and the idea was that I would try to find one person who could kind of embody the story of everyone, and then I would then try to follow that person home. And I talked to many guys, and in fact we took Martha worked closely with me and Esther on this. We had surveys in 3 or 4 different languages that we filled out. We wrote questions ourselves, and we created a database to actually find out as much as we could about where these men had come from and what had happened to them and which boats had trafficked them. And while I was there, I met a man who was Burmese, and he told me that he had been trafficked from Thailand to Indonesia in 1993. And that's the year I graduated from high school. And he had not had contact with his family, anyone, in that entire 22-year period. And so at that point, I knew I had my guy. And here you see, this is the first time that they're getting their names back. It's written in Burmese and their age, and they've got what boat they were on, and they're so happy to finally have their identities back again. And here they are, kind of lining up to go home. And again, this was the guy that I followed back, and Esther and I met him at the airport. And we didn't know at that point what we were going to find, whether he was going to find his parents or what was going to be the outcome. But we went back with him. We drove overnight and went back with him to his village. And we were in the car, and when he saw this woman, he just leaped out of the car and just started running. And at that point, he was screaming, she was screaming. They were in the middle of the street in this dusty, very poor village, and people were coming out of their houses and saying, "Oh my goodness, this guy's been gone for 20 years. We thought he was dead." And then, he was so frantic to see his mom. And then they were calling her on the phone. And then you saw in the video, when he spotted her, he just collapsed on the ground. And Esther and I, we were standing on the side of the road at that point, trying to stay out of the shot, because we'd been warned not to get in the way of the cameras. So we were staying well away from this whole scene that was unfolding. But I remember, we were just kind of watching this movie unfold in front of us, and we were hugging, and we were saying, wow, this is happening all over Southeast Asia because of our reporting. And I think for the students who are here tonight, if any of you have any question about whether investigative journalism is still relevant today, with all of the craziness that you see on television, I hope that you seeing this and seeing that you can make a difference in more than 2,000 people's lives. You can literally free slaves. So.
Well, thank you for sharing that, those wonderful pictures and explanations about the backstory of your series. I want to ask you all some questions, and then I will go to the audience to see what questions you all have. So Margie, though, let's pick up with where the series went next, because the more than 2,000 fishermen were released, but it didn't end there. Where did you all go next with this reporting?
Well, I guess Robin and Martha were a big part of the next story. Robin, do you want to talk about the first part of it, and Martha, you want to take the second part?
Yeah, sure. So when we went to Benjina with the investigative team to interview the men, the thing that struck me almost immediately was there should have been more men. We knew how many boats were parked out who were in the harbor. There was, as I said, a moratorium in place, and the minister had called in all the fishing boats. So, just doing the basic math that there should be 20 men on each boat on average, and there were 50 boats out there, and only a few hundred men. That we were missing about 700 men, including some of the men that Esther and I had interviewed during that first trip. So I was really as happy as I was to see what was going on. I was very worried about those other men and assuming the worst, and which in fact happened is the captains fled with the men before the investigative team had arrived and had headed to other waters. So we started asking on Benjina, and also Esther started asking in Myanmar if there was any way we could find out where these men had gone. And basically what we'd learned also from the investigative team was that some of these boats had several flags inside their holds. So they had a Papua New Guinea flag, a Thai flag, an Indonesian flag, and an East Timor flag. So they basically, the way these guys operate often is if there is a spotlight that shines on them, they scurry away like cockroaches and start operating someplace else. And with having these 4 flags, that's an easy thing to do. We basically narrowed down, they seemed to be in Papua New Guinea, that enough of the men said that their friends said they were going to Papua New Guinea waters, that some of the men back in Myanmar said they'd heard that people were talking about going to Papua New Guinea. So we called Martha and said, you have to find these guys.
Robin is like this, Martha, you have to find these guys on the phone. And I'm like, somebody in Papua New Guinea, how in the world am I supposed to find a boat off Papua New Guinea? And Margie, I don't know, she found these fishing licenses also, that some of the names of the boats from Benjina were also getting fishing licenses in Papua New Guinea. And so we had an idea of where they might be, a big idea of where they potentially could be in this big swath of ocean. And we talked about going to Papua New Guinea. We talked about getting drones. And we finally decided if we could get some satellite imagery, some high resolution photos, that would be great. So I called the Pentagon, because they have some high resolution photos, it seems to me, and talked to their press desk. And, you know, entering that conversation as a journalist is tricky. Like, hi, I'm a reporter with AP. Yeah, what do you need, Martha? Well, there's these boats with slaves on them somewhere around Papua New Guinea, and I was hoping, you know, I called NASA because I thought they would have some good photos from the sky. And the conversation was similar, of a boat with slaves. I also called a lot of people who never called me back, who I thought might have access to satellite photos from the sky. And I emailed the press person at this company called Digital Globe that takes a photo of every place on planet Earth at 10 in the morning every single day, which is a little creepy if you think about it, but they're doing it. And I emailed their press person, didn't hear back, and then I looked up the CEO's home phone number and private email through our special databases.
Do
and
not
contacted
ever get on her bad side.
Contacted him directly, and he was like, what? You think that we might be able to use our images to help find slaves? Yes. Well, where do you think the area is? We'll task our camera. And the next day they did take a shot of about 500 square miles at sea and sent me the photo right away. And it's this like big green blurry thing. And I was like, oh, after all that. But their analysts zoomed in on it, and they actually found these Benjina boats doing what's called transshipment, offloading their fish onto a big boat. Like, they found them, and we were able to get in touch with authorities. And those boats, in fact, I just checked, it was a Silver Sea 2 boat, is still seized, and they arrested more people and they freed more slaves.
Can you all talk about the ethical issues you faced as journalists, because you became very invested in this story and very concerned about these men when you found them, but then had to go away to do your reporting? Can you talk about the issues you faced there, and the ethical issues especially?
This is Margie. Yeah, we forgot to mention one of the most important parts of the story when we were going through this, and that is
in our minds.
Yeah, in our minds. You know, we were always very conscious of these men, their safety. That was, for us, so important. And you know, after we found this island and we connected the dots, we had this dilemma, and that is, okay, if we publish, you know, the pictures of the guy in the cage and their names and all of this, they're still in a confined situation where they're enslaved. So we were grappling with, okay, you know, they could be hurt or maybe even killed, because we knew this was going to be an explosive story. And so we went to our editors and we were having conversations, and we didn't know what AP would want to do, because normally as journalists, you know, our job is to kind of observe and stand back. We don't really get involved in things, but this was a very special story. And so our editors all agreed that, well, yes, we should try to rescue these guys. And we said, oh, that's great. How should we do this? And they said, well, you figure it out, basically. And so somehow I was tasked with rescuing the slaves. And so I went back to my original source at the IOM, and I took the video that we had, and I showed it to him. And I said, you know, this is incredibly powerful, but we're going to have to change their names, or we're going to have, you know, not use their names, or we're going to have to cut this part out with them in the cages and everything. And I said, can you help us? Can you reach the guys who we are identifying in our story and get them off? And he said, yes, I will do my best. And so he went to the Marine Police in Indonesia, and they then went to the island with pictures that we had provided of all these men. And a lot of them were just screenshots. Well, okay, that's great, except the men were terrified to go with the police. They thought that they were being rounded up for some reason and going to be jailed or deported, or who knew what was going to happen. And so then Esther and I had to convince the men that we were the ones behind this, and that it was okay, it was safe to get on the boats. And so Esther was on the phone, and we were on a three-way call for I don't know what.
Yeah, you were calling me, and then you were calling to them as well, through this Navy boat, and they were all scared. At some point, also on the same day, they got the wrong pictures of some guys, and then it was just like testing somewhere in the dark that we are only dealing this case from the phone, and that island is just too far away, and we need to get them out on the same day. So I think I was just screaming on the phone, and people around me in Burma was just looking at me like a crazy lady on the street. And yeah, Margie and I actually at the end of the day sorted out that we got 8 guys on a boat, 8 guys that we were going to use in our story out. So.
And a few stragglers just jumped on the boat too.
And then and you held off on reporting or on releasing your first story until you had accomplished that. So yeah, your reporting also took you to Thailand after, and you said, you know, don't get Martha mad, but in our conversation, I would say don't get Margie mad, because tell them why you went to Thailand and looked at shrimp sheds.
Well, you know, we were trying to show in this reporting, and we've said all along that this is one little sliver of the industry, and we were looking at Thailand. But this whole industry has problems. But when we found Benjina, when Robin was, I think she was going to Benjina for the rescue, there was a Thai general who was coming out. And there was an interview with him, and he said, look, they're all Thai, and everybody seems to be pretty happy. You know, there's maybe a few people who aren't feeling so well and want to go home, but for the most part, it's all good. And I think that really, that really upset us. And so then we said, okay. And then they said, well, the Thai officials were saying, look, this is happening in Indonesia, so this is an Indonesia problem, not a Thai problem. So then we said, okay, well, we're going to look in your backyard. We're going to look in the backyard of Bangkok and see what's happening, and then find out if there's issues there. And then we started looking at the shrimp sheds. So all of the shrimp that you all get here at Red Lobster or in the supermarket, it's all the tails, the heads, it's all deveined. All of that is very labor intensive, and it's done by a lot of people, for the most part, in Thailand. It's done by women, it's done by children, and we found people who were locked inside sheds, forced to do it for 16, 17 hours a day, and not paid or paid very little. And so, again, with that, we followed trucks, and we connected Martha. You connected it to how many companies?
More than 50 this time. Yeah, we were much better. You know, the second time around on our methodology, we were much better at it. Yeah.
And then we got reporters in all 50 states. This is the power of the AP. We have bureaus in all 50 states. So we sent reporters out in every state to look for these brands. And even my mom went shopping out here in Blacksville and found it. We had people in Morgantown getting stuff for us. I mean, it was everywhere.
And I want to touch on some of the series' most recent reports before I go to questions from the audience. And that includes what you all found in Hawaii, actually. And Martha, do you want to talk about the latest reports in the series that deal with the fishing industry in Hawaii?
Sure. I end up going to a lot of seafood conferences, and sometimes I'm not so welcome at them. But I was at one in San Francisco, and a fisher woman and I were actually the only women in the room. And so at break, I went over and talked to her, and she said, "Oh, you're doing those stories? You know what? You should come down to Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco and check out this boat. There's all these starving guys on it, and they're never allowed off the boat. And you should take a look at that." And I was like, okay. And it ends up that in the Hawaii-based fishery, which also has boats come in up and down the West Coast, they have a special exemption to all kinds of labor and wage laws and immigration laws. And they are crewed, the entire fleet of 140 boats, all the crew members on board, with a few small exceptions, are Indonesian, Filipino, Vietnamese, migrant workers who are never allowed to set foot on U.S. soil. So even to get to the job, to fish, they have to get picked up at sea and get brought by boat. And you see them, it ends up, Margie and I saw them both in Hawaii and in San Francisco, stuck on their boats. Their captain holds their passport, and of course this makes them very vulnerable to all kinds of labor abuse, and we found evidence of human trafficking, as well as running sores from bed bug infestations on these boats. And this is, you know, fine Hawaiian seafood, American-owned boats, American captain boats, American seafood.
And there's already been some changes to legislation, right? Can you talk about
Well,
that?
there's quite an attempt to right now to figure out what the loopholes are, how to solve this problem without either having all these men, some 700 men, lose their jobs, or have them subject to forced labor. Like, how do you have that balance? Because they don't have a visa stamp in their passport, so they're not allowed into the United States. And so they're trying to solve this. Meanwhile, Whole Foods just cut off the entire seafood auction, so they're not going to buy from there. And some other companies have taken similar actions. So they're scrambling.
Yeah, you mentioned that they can't step foot on American soil. So in one of the reports it says that in some cases they had to jump into the ocean and swim to their boat of employment. So
Yeah, it was an amazing video of these guys just going through the waves, and they would, you know, there'd be a rope between for them to kind of hang on to sometimes. But out there in the middle of the Great Pacific to be doing that is terrifying.
yes, absolutely. We will have questions from the audience now, and so if you do have a question, we have some folks walking around with microphones, so if you just raise your hand, and they will come to you, and just make sure that you speak directly into the microphone so that we can all hear you.
By the way, I want to thank you all for coming here this evening and just gracing us with your time. I know it's very precious, and I mentor about I would say around 50 journalism students right now, and I want to know what tips or advice can you give someone who might want to get into this level of investigative journalism?
Well, I think Margie started off by saying that everyone knew about this story. In a way, they knew there were abuses in the Thai fishing industry, that it was an open secret. And I think one of the things that we really felt coming off this story was a lot of people, when there's a big thing that happens, like whether it's the mafia killing people or missing children or whatever, you kind of think that's too big of a story. It's been kind of done before. What can we bring to it? But in a way, the bigger the open secret is, the bigger the story is if you can find a way to illustrate it in a way that makes people pay attention and not think, oh, this is just an old story I've heard before. The bigger the open secret, the bigger the story if you can nail it, basically.
Thank you.
experience mold you not only as a person but as a journalist?
We have definitely molded her.
Well, I've been working as a journalist for about more than 3.5 years, and it's been always a learning process for me. But since the day I came back from that island, I felt this load on my shoulder that I carried along with me. So I was just thinking that sometimes we don't just walk as a journalist, we also walk as a person who can change something. And and what I learned from this whole investigations was how powerful your work can be, or the way you change your community, because more than half, almost all, majority of these people who enslaved were from my own country. So you might understand like how I would feel when I was actually interviewing these people, leaving them behind when I left. So I learned a lot about not only working as a journalist and a person who make the change to the community.
I'm just sitting here and with some of the opening comments, actually it was the communication, Margie, between you and the moderator. It kind of stuck me, and that was the play back and forth about the Department of Media or Investigative Journalism. And what I'd like you to comment on is that to do what you're doing requires stamina, smarts, financial resources, and it also requires political will of your bosses to invest in that time. 40 years ago, I would say every small newspaper strongly encouraged that. And newspapers were the watchdogs. And now, today, it seems as though if there's not a body, a smoking gun, and we can get a quick story out of it, there's no political will at the newspapers to do those stories. So if you could just, is that an oversimplification on my part, or are we headed that way as journalists? And then on the other hand, what did you have to go through, or what do you go through on a daily basis to pitch those stories, understanding that your bosses have to answer to advertisers and people of that nature?
So there's, I think that newspapers are happy to have a good investigative story, but what they don't want to do and can't do is invest the time and resources to make it happen. And uniquely at the AP, we all have to cover spot news. During this year, like there was airplane crashes, and I'd be like, Margie, you have to go knock on the door at that company. She's like, yeah, well, airplane crash, I gotta stop and do it. I had an airplane crash that year too, actually. So yeah, so we're all doing spot news. And as a newspaper reporter and then as a wire service reporter, I always felt like it was really important to keep generating copy, keep coming up with spot stories, and have that big investigative project going, and keep a to-do list, stay well organized so that if you have a half hour, you're going to make a couple calls. If you have 2 hours, you're going to maybe start doing some research. So you got anybody who's a journalism student, if you feel excited about doing investigative reporting, you don't necessarily want to be telling your bosses, hey, I want to be an investigative reporter and I'm going to do this great project and look into this whole thing. You need to work your beat, as they did for 9 months, while you are working on your investigation, and then it hits a point where it's irresistible, where they cannot, no editor anywhere can help themselves but to say, yes, you better take some time to do this, because I mean, in our case, the resources came when they said, we're pretty gosh darn sure there's an island with slaves on it, and at that point an editor said, well, then we have a moral imperative to go there. Who wouldn't say that? So
Yeah, that's really hits it on the head. For us, it's like we don't even bother pitching the story until it's so irresistible, like Martha said, because we don't want to be turned down, we don't want to be discouraged, and we don't want to be rushed if they get kind of excited about something and then they push you faster than you want to be pushed, you're not going to get the best story either. You're going to be kind of satisfying the beast. So keep a lot of secrets from our bosses.
I think it makes it a lot easier for us to do this type of work. I mean, we don't have to be as secretive now about what we're doing. There, when we come up with an idea, maybe it's not so harebrained. So I think from that respect, at the AP, again, our bread and butter is spot news. Most people, when something happens, the AP is, we're first and we're first and we're right. Those are our two, that
goals.
It's what we do. We're the first to get it, and we're right. If we're saying it's happening, it's really happening. And so the investigative stuff is harder to juggle. But I also think that, as Pat pointed out, things are changing a little bit, and you've got, you turn on the television and you have people just yelling at each other, and that's, in some people's minds, that's journalism. And I think that when you do this type of deep dive investigative work, it could just, you might think it would just get lost in the shuffle of everything that's happening, but it really stands out. People step back and pay attention, and action is, we were shocked at how quickly people jumped up and said, this is an outrage, we've got to do something. And unfortunately, we'd like to say that this problem is fixed, but it's not. It's not fixed. There are a lot of people looking at it now and trying to find ways to improve it. But we're continuing with this. We're continuing, as we said, we just did this story 3 weeks ago from Hawaii, and we're still looking at this elsewhere. So I think having this Pulitzer Prize certainly kind of helps us to move forward as we do and pitch more projects.
It's super helpful to me and my family because my kids and my husband will hear from other people that this is a big deal, and then they're like, wow, Mom, maybe you are actually, doing something with all those late night phone calls. It also takes a very long time to sink in. I've been telling them it.
She's being very modest, by the way. She has 2. So.
In the year after, it's very much a rush, especially because we keep having more and more stories. But in the bigger picture, in a way, it settled my ambition the first time. So I had been incredibly ambitious, and it kind of gave me a mark of like, I'm doing this. It's okay. I don't need to be almost in the panic mode of ambitioning. Like, I can just do this. This is successful. And it also gave me a confidence, particularly when people would be trying to push me back or push me down. It just made me feel a little bit more like, you know what? I've got this. I know what I'm doing, and I'm confident to push back. I don't know at this point. We don't need any more of that hubris, perhaps. For you, what it means to have won a Pulitzer Prize?
The first in Burma, by the way.
Well, it actually, more than the prize is to see this man coming back home. And Robin and I would go to the airport 1 in the morning or 2 in the morning to see this man and try to make contacts with them. That is just the best feeling for me. And also, at the end, what I got was journalism does change, makes change, and that's what I believe in now. So.
And I'd like to add a little bit to Esther's story because as Margie started talking about covering the story that we were working on before, the fish was the persecuted Muslim minority in Myanmar, the Rohingya, and they are despised pretty much across the board in Myanmar. It's a primarily Buddhist nationalist country, and they really believe that the Rohingya should not be there, that they should all be kind of like, I don't know, they wouldn't mind if they all died, basically. And so the abuses against them were really horrific. And Esther, who is also from a minority, a Christian minority, the Kachin, we actually hired her for the AP because we needed somebody who could cover and care about the story, and we couldn't find really the right Buddhist Burmese reporters to do that. And she went out and, with incredible courage, covered some really tough stories that other people in the country were ignoring. And she got a lot of heat for it from the other journalists. She was a new journalist. They didn't like that she was focusing any attention on them at all. And I think for me, I'm really just so proud and happy to see this Pulitzer, because it's hard for them to now say that she wasn't right about that too.
Well, and I think that's a wonderful note to end our discussion on tonight about the Pulitzer. You will go to New York on Wednesday to accept it. So I hope you'll all join me in thanking and congratulating these 4 exceptional journalists for being here tonight and in winning the Pulitzer Prize. So thank you, Margie Mason, Robin McDowell, Martha Mendoza, and Esther Htusan. And thank you to our audience here at West Virginia University. Good night.